What sort of mind could weaponize hunger itself? This is a chilling chapter in the dark history of warfare, and Genghis Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, was its master, perfecting the art of the siege. He transformed the starvation tactic into a horrifying instrument of conquest. His armies wouldn't just storm a city, they would encircle it, severing all lifelines, and then they would wait, not for mere days, but for agonizing weeks, and sometimes even months. Behind the walls, bread became dust, rats disappeared from the streets, and the deceased were silently consumed by the desperate living. In the year 1219, as Genghis Khan swept into the Khwarezmian Empire, he laid siege to the great city of Nishapur, lacking the means for a swift assault on its formidable walls. Methodically, the Mongols enveloped the entire settlement. They choked off all food supplies, tainted the nearby wells with poison, and established an impenetrable perimeter, ensuring that no one could get in, and more importantly, no one could get out. This was not an act of desperation. It was a cold, calculated strategy. Mongol engineers were even trained to estimate precisely how long a city's provisions would last, waiting for the moment the threshold of starvation was crossed. Sheer desperation would inevitably drive the defenders to collapse. Some cities capitulated before a single sword was drawn, while those that resisted were doomed to face horrors far worse than a swift death. According to the Persian chronicler Atamalik Juwayni, the inhabitants of these besieged cities were sometimes driven to consume leather, grass, and in the most harrowing of circumstances, even the flesh of their own dead. Of Merv, another city starved into submission, he wrote, "None remained to bury the corpses, and the dogs feasted on the flesh of the faithful, a truly grim account from this era's dark history." When the city gates at last gave way, the Mongols showed no mercy. The survivors, utterly gaunt and emaciated, were skeletal figures, barely recognizable as human, only to be systematically massacred or taken as slaves. This siege by starvation was more than a military tactic. It was a psychological weapon designed to broadcast a terrifying message. Resistance would lead not just to death, but to a slow, degrading, and utterly helpless demise. And among the spoils of war, the fate of captured women was a particularly cruel one. Genghis Khan, the universal ruler of the Mongols, spearheaded one of the most brutal expansions in all of human history. His armies did not merely defeat their foes, they systematically dismantled entire civilizations. In the aftermath of every victory, the destiny of captured women followed a chillingly consistent pattern. Following the fall of Bukhara in 1220, the Mongols seized thousands of women and girls. Many were distributed among the soldiers as spoils, a reward for their service. The higher a soldier's rank, the more prestigious the captives he received. Women of noble birth were frequently reserved for Mongol generals, or even for Genghis Khan himself, while women of lower status were divided amongst the common troops, or condemned to a life of menial labor, servitude, and often a fate far worse. Juwayni, the Persian historian who chronicled the Mongol conquests firsthand, recorded how, after a city fell, they separated the men from the women, the children from their mothers, and drove them into camps like herds of sheep. This was not a metaphor. It reflected the cold, almost industrial efficiency with which the Mongols processed human life. Women were frequently paraded before commanders, where they were ranked by their appearance, age, and social standing. In this brutal calculus, beauty became a curse. Accounts from Chinese, Persian, and Russian sources all corroborate this, describing how Mongol leaders took explicit pride in seizing the wives and daughters of vanquished nobles, not merely as concubines, but as the ultimate symbol of their absolute dominance. This humiliation was entirely intentional. To possess the women of a defeated enemy was to obliterate his legacy. While some women were absorbed into Mongol households and forced into marriage, countless others were sold into slavery across the vast expanse of the empire. From the steppes of Central Asia to the opulent Yuan court in China, very few, if any, ever retained their original identities. For the empire of Genghis Khan, expansion was never just about acquiring land. It was about reducing people to property, to be consumed by the war machine. And among the most defenseless were the women, whose suffering remains one of the most haunting legacies in the dark history of the Mongol path to empire. Just one of many brutal tactics employed by Genghis Khan. Renowned as the founder of the Mongol Empire in 1206, Genghis Khan's legacy is stained with a tactic of chilling calculation, the use of human shields. This chapter of dark history was no mere accident of war, but a deliberate and systematic policy of terror. Captured civilians, frequently from newly subjugated towns, were compelled to march at the vanguard of the Mongol army, straight into the enemy's line of fire. Their very bodies served a grim purpose: to absorb the initial volley of arrows, deplete the defenders' ammunition, and sow chaos and confusion among the ranks. One of the most notorious instances of this brutal strategy occurred during the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, specifically at the siege of Gurganj in 1221. As the city's resistance intensified and its defenses became more desperate, Genghis Khan commanded that thousands of prisoners, primarily women, children, and the elderly, be forced to the front lines, creating a living buffer between his warriors and the city's fortifications. The Persian historian Juvayni, who documented the Mongol campaigns in his work, Tariq-e-Jahangushe, observed how the Mongols rarely spared anyone in a resisting city, yet paradoxically kept captives alive, only to serve as expendable instruments of war. They used the people of one city to batter down the next, he wrote with grim clarity, chronicling this terrifying machinery of conquest in motion. These unfortunate human shields were positioned before siege engines or bound together in rows to make escape impossible. Others were forced to dig trenches, carry supplies, or fill in moats, all while enduring a constant barrage of enemy fire. Should they manage to survive the initial assault, their reward was often death, as they had served their grim purpose and were no longer of any use. This tactic was more than just a military strategy. It was a chilling psychological weapon that sent a clear message: surrender, or watch your own people be forced to die in your stead. This sheer, calculated ruthlessness shattered the morale of countless defenders before a single sword was even unsheathed. To the Mongols, warfare was not a matter of chivalry or mercy. It was governed by one thing: results. And if achieving victory required sacrificing thousands of innocent lives to break a fortress's will to fight, then that price was not merely acceptable, it was an expected cost of conquest. For Genghis Khan, war was absolute, a conflict not just between soldiers, but one where entire populations were used as pawns in a horrifying game. Now, consider death by trampling, the verdict of the steppe. In 1223, after the Mongols annihilated a coalition of Rus princes and their Kipchak allies at the decisive Battle of the Kalka River, the captured survivors were met not with mercy, but with a meticulously planned and humiliating demise. The Mongols, under the command of the brilliant generals Subutai and Jebe, acting on the authority of Genghis Khan, had absolutely no intention of treating their prisoners as honorable adversaries. Instead, they transformed their punishment into a grotesque spectacle of absolute power. Mstislav of Kiev and the other captured Rus' nobles were not to be executed by the sword or by fire. According to both Rus' and Persian historical sources, the Mongols forced these princes to lie face down upon the ground, and then, in a chillingly deliberate performance, they constructed a massive wooden platform directly upon their living bodies. A great victory feast was then held on top of this structure, where the Mongol commanders celebrated, drinking and dining, as their prisoners were slowly crushed and suffocated beneath them. This is a truly grim moment in our planet's dark history, and while historical accounts may differ on minor details, the Russian primary chronicle and subsequent Persian narratives are united in their depiction of the essential horror. The Mongols selected this method of execution very specifically because it inflicted unimaginable suffering without shedding a single drop of noble blood. Within Mongol legal and cultural tradition, particularly when dealing with high-ranking enemies, it was often considered taboo to spill their blood directly upon the earth. So they devised a method of execution that was utterly brutal, yet, in a technical sense, entirely bloodless. The outcome was an excruciatingly slow death, as the victory feast continued above. The immense weight of the platform, combined with the commanders seated upon it, slowly and agonizingly crushed the life from the men trapped below. By the time the banquet concluded, the lives of the Rus nobles had also ended. Their bodies were shattered, their dignity utterly annihilated. This execution was far more than simple vengeance. It was a powerful and terrifying demonstration, an act of psychological warfare, just as much as it was a physical punishment. By transforming death into a grotesque victory celebration, the Mongols asserted their supremacy not merely through military might, but through the complete domination of memory, reputation, and legacy itself. Next, we explore being dragged behind horses, the ultimate punishment reserved for traitors. Of all the brutal punishments enacted under Genghis Khan's rule, one was reserved specifically for the ultimate sin of betrayal, being bound to a horse and mercilessly dragged to death. This was no common battlefield execution. It was a deliberate sentence, aimed squarely at those who had violated a sacred trust. The condemned were defectors, spies, or governors who surrendered a city only to resist later. In the unforgiving Mongol legal system, treason wasn't simple disobedience. It was a tear in the fabric of the Khan's world order, and it demanded a public, irreversible response. The punishment was brutally direct. The condemned individuals' hands were tied fast. Sometimes their limbs were dislocated to prevent any struggle, before they were fastened by ropes to a warhorse at an officer's command. The horse was then spurred into a gallop, pulling the victim across rugged, unforgiving ground, often for vast distances. Death was rarely instantaneous. It was a horrifying ordeal that could last for minutes or longer, depending entirely on the terrain. Historical records of this sentence appear throughout the Mongol campaigns in Central Asia and the Middle East. Whenever cities under their control dared to rebel, or when governors were caught secretly conspiring with rival powers. This method was a standard form of execution, public, efficient, and designed to leave a terrifyingly visible warning. A mutilated body, dragged through the dust and left discarded before the city walls. The reasoning behind this form of execution, a key part of their dark history, was rooted in Mongol concepts of loyalty and deterrence. Genghis Khan had forged a strict code of laws known as the Yasa, which demanded absolute allegiance to the state and to the Khan himself. Anyone who jeopardized internal unity was viewed as a direct threat to the empire's very stability. There was no need for a prolonged spectacle. This punishment was designed to be fast and final. The Mongol Empire did not merely conquer lands, it dismantled entire worlds and rewrote the rules of power using fear, discipline, and unforgiving justice. Its punishments were not acts of chaos, they were messages carved into human flesh, meant to echo across generations. These were not excesses, they were strategies of domination, a chilling cornerstone of their dark history. Comment below, how do you think the Mongols' use of punishment fueled their rise from nomads to rulers of the largest land empire in history? As Giovanni wrote, they came, they undermined, they burned, they slaughtered, they plundered, and they departed.